Kim Moody, and I'm your host for In the Mood with Kim GC Moody podcast. This podcast will discuss, educate, and have some lively debate and discussion on tax policy, taxation issues, leadership topics, economics, and the odd political comment as it relates to all of those previous topics, all in a fun and playful style. Come along for the ride. Well, good day. My name is Kim Moody, and I'm your host for In the Mood with Kim GC Moody podcast. And today is February the 6th, 2026. Time's going fast already this year. Hopefully we can get winter out of the way. I know some of my Ontario and Eastern friends have been hit hard with snow and cold. And thankfully in Western Canada here, we've been had a pretty mild winter altogether. But enough about the weather, enough about, looking forward to summer and spring, which of course I am. But let's talk about what's happening in Canadian tax, and no shortage of stuff happening. But I want to frame it around just beyond tax gimmicks. We've had a whole host of tax gimmicks being introduced into tax policy in the last little while, and certainly the start of 2026 is no stranger to that. And so, just what is tax gimmicks? Well, in my layman's opinion, layman's definition, it's when simple politics gets introduced into the Income Tax Act. And just reach over my desk here and show you, this is volume 1 of the Income Tax Act. You'll see it's for those that are watching the YouTube portion of this podcast, that's volume 1, and then over here is volume 2, and so you'll see it's roughly, put it together, this is the Combined Income Tax Act. So it's pretty thick, it's growing, but what's been happening with this statute is that it's being cluttered with gimmicks, political gimmicks, stuff that ultimately achieves political objectives rather than looking at what's good for the common good, what's good for the public good. And, what are some recent examples? I mean, I could go on and talk to you about what's been introduced into the Income Tax Act in the last 40, 50 years for political gimmicks, because, this is not something new. Politics and tax, like I've written about for many times, is like good wine and good cheese. They're inextricably linked together. But what I've been advocating for quite a long time, and there's a lot of my colleagues have as well, is the simple politics just have no place in the functioning of a good tax system. And ultimately, what does simple politics do? Well, it makes for bad policy because it usually chooses one group of voters to the exclusion of another group. In other words, that's the politics involved. Or it causes complexity. Or it causes a bunch of confusion. And the list of damage could go on. But, I've made a list just in front of me here of just some recent political gimmicks. And actually, I just remembered one. So I'll add it right now. But one of the political ones that got introduced in 2023, I believe, is the so-called flipping tax. So if you're going to own a residential property, whether it's your personal house or a residential property, like a rental property, and you acquire it and then sell it within 365 days, well, instead of you being able to treat that as a capital disposition, if there's a gain, for example, then no, these new rules just introduce an automatic objective test saying that if you have sold it or disposed of it within 365 days from the date of acquisition, any resulting profit is not a capital gain. It's fully taxable as business income. And that to me is just, first of all, it's not necessary. We have existing rules in the Act to deal with flippers, which apparently is what this policy was designed for, because, those damn evil flippers were certainly the cause of the housing crisis, which is ultimately what these rules were aimed at. Now, from a pure policy perspective, I can understand that the existing rules, there's no objective test in terms of when it's capital and when it's not. So you could have situations where there are flippers, and the flippers are doing this for a living and they're treating it as capital gains for on and on and on. But to introduce a 365-day rule with certain life exceptions, like if you get divorced or if you have a health issue or what have you, or move for employment purposes, that just causes complete complexity, a confusion in the policy, and it's just simply unnecessary. And that's simple politics because obviously the government wanted to create a boogeyman as to who was causing the housing crisis rather than dealing with the root cause, which was out of control immigration. So that's an example. Another example is the crazy GST holiday that happened before Prime Minister Trudeau resigned. And so in mid-December of 2024, all of a sudden, the Santa Claus came to town, and GST was going to be exempt on certain things. And there's a long list, and I wrote about this in one of my Financial Post pieces. I can't even imagine, you have people in the Prime Minister's office or some other policy office that all of a sudden brainstorms and makes a list of what things should be GST exempt to try to achieve certain political objectives. That is just crazy. It went from mid-December to mid-February of 2025, so not that long ago, and caused a whole bunch of confusion. I wrote about that ad nauseum in the Financial Post, and just crazy policy. And then, fast forward a year later to present day, and last week we had an announcement that the GST credit is going to be now rebranded as the grocery rebate. I'm simplifying it, it's a little bit longer. And there'll be enhancements to that for the next 5 years. There'll be a lump sum payment in June, or sometime this spring in 2026, and then increased quarterly benefits for the next 5 years. And this particular enhancement is centered around affordability measures and ultimately as a handout. Now, why do I not like that? Again, it's a gimmick. It's a gimmick because the GST credit, as I wrote about in my Financial Post article of this week, the GST credit and the GST itself is well designed. So let's take a step back and go back in history, which I did in my Financial Post article. The GST was introduced in 1991. It was a replacement for the old manufacturer's sales tax, which was introduced in 1924. And it became very inefficient. It caused tax on tax situations. It was just not good. And so courageously, the government at the time, Prime Minister Brian Mulroney's government, thought, okay, we got to get rid of this inefficient tax. So they did, and we'll replace it with a value-added tax like other countries around the world have had. A lot of European countries, for example. And from a policy perspective, it makes perfect sense, right? It's transparent. You know what you're going to charge it on. But the problem is that sales taxes like that can be very regressive. And what do I mean by that? Well, economists talk about this quite a bit. If you charge 5%, which originally the GST was 7%, by the way, if you charge 5% on $100 for goods or services, that extra $5 is certainly going to cause a lot more harm to the poor or to the lower income people than it will to the higher income people. And so should a sales tax be that way? Well, ideally not. Ideally, it would be somewhat neutralized so that it's not as regressive and that the poor are not unfairly burdened with that tax comparatively. And so the way that GST was designed was, okay, well, let's try to take away the GST from the essentials of life, the basic necessities of life, groceries, healthcare, most financial services, pharmaceuticals, and certain education. And education is not a necessity of life, but ultimately they didn't want to have the poor pay more for education than the rich. And so but the problem is whenever you, of course, have those exceptions, that causes complexity. So, for example, with groceries, and this is still a well-known example, it's only supposed to be for basic groceries, not for junk food, for example. So a classic one is if I buy one donut, that's subject to GST. But if I buy a half a dozen donuts, there's no GST. You figure that one out. In my view, I think it should have been just across the board food, just to make it a lot simpler. But no, in order to achieve other social objectives, I guess to not encourage junk food consumption, there is going to be GST on non-basics. So that causes complexity. But that issue aside, the regressiveness by taking away the GST on those basic essentials is good, right? I think that's a good policy objective. And I think you'd have a hard time finding anybody that disagrees with that. But in order to, further enhance this, the GST credit was introduced in 1991, and ultimately it was designed just for lower income people. And so lower income was defined to be a certain threshold. You had to file your personal income tax return in order to get eligibility for that GST credit. And the calculations are automatically done as part of that every year. And so whatever your computed GST credit would be, you would get a check every quarter. And that system has been around since 1991. And I think when you combine the exemptions, I guess technically for accountants and other tax geeks that are listening here, exemptions and zero rated stuff, along with the GST credit, that combination of a package reduces the regressiveness of the GST. And I think it's well designed and it's efficient. So fast forward to COVID, and we had lots and lots of spending and handouts, and there was, one-time GST increase for whatever. I mean, I kind of lost track of all the ridiculous COVID handout stuff. And then fast forward to the GST holiday that I've already talked about. And then now, of course, we have the rebranding of the GST credit to this groceries rebate. Well, for any tax geeks and public policy geeks like I try to be, first of all, that's offensive marketing. It's not a groceries rebate. I mean, to be real technical here, groceries are exempt from GST to begin with, except for the junk food that I already illustrated. And so to call it a groceries rebate, come on. This is pure politics, and ultimately it's thinly veiled vote buying. And to suggest that it's good policy, in my view, is ridiculous. Now, anybody listening to this would say, well, geez, Kim, you're pretty cold-hearted, aren't you? Because the poor are certainly struggling. And I would rebut to that and say, if you knew me personally, you would know that I'm very, very philanthropically inclined. I have a big heart, at least I think I do. But at the same time, I don't like the entrenchment of the welfare state. And what do I mean by that? Well, Jack Mintz wrote a great piece on that in the Financial Post last week. And when you get the population such that the government is the answer to all your problems, and of course you're going to hand out checks to make some of those problems be mitigated, probably not disappear, but mitigated, that's the entrenchment of the welfare state. And in my view, that's not good. That's not good for human beings in general. Yes, we need to take care of our vulnerable, no question about it. But in general, while there's always improvements necessary and revisits to how we take care of our vulnerable, I think it's been pretty good. Now, having said that, like I said, there's always room for improvement. And when you have huge inflation that's happened in Canada and continued big spending by government, which fuels cost of living. Like if you look at the cost of groceries, this has been well publicized, and I put it in my Financial Post piece last week. The price of groceries in Canada continues to far exceed the rate of inflation, on the average rate of inflation. That's not good. That's not good. And there's reasons for that. And the systemic and root problems of that are complex, but a lot of it is fueled by supply chains and just a lot of money in the system with government spending. And so my premise being is, hey, I'm not trying to ignore the vulnerable. Far from it. But we need to really look at the systemic and root causes of what's causing, food prices, for example, to increase. And do we need to clutter the tax system and politicize the tax system even more with garbage policy? No. And so the people that have wrote to me and said, hey, Moody, I see you don't care about the poor. Well, I don't think I ever said that in my articles. And far from it, I do care about the poor. What I care about is the entrenchment of the welfare state. You know what? There's value in hard work. Instead of getting people addicted to handouts, why don't we incentivize hard work? I'll just, I put some good quotes in front of me here. Thomas Edison, the famous inventor, he had lots of sayings, but he said, genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. Beautiful. It's so true. Winston Churchill, one of my favorites, said, continuous effort, not strength or intelligence, is the key to unlocking our potential. Absolutely. As a country, we need to continuously work, try to improve our lagging and just pathetic productivity, rather than get our population addicted to handouts. Our country has so much potential. Benjamin Franklin, this is one of my favorites as well. Well done is better than well said. No question. You can get up there and do all the speeches you want. I don't care who you are. But ultimately, it's actions that matter more. And so to get people entrenched in the welfare state and encourage them not to work is certainly not the answer, in my view. So what are some ideas? Well, beyond what I've been trumpeting for a long, long time, which is tax reform, we need to look at everything to try and encourage and incentivize our population to work hard. And that, in my view, means putting more money in their pockets from their efforts, not from government handouts, but from their efforts. The incentive to work hard should be there. To get up. Viktor Frankl, one of the most famous authors, Man's Search for Meaning. If people don't have a purpose, in many cases, what's the point? Like, in other words, human beings should have a purpose. They should be excited to get out of bed in the morning and go to work. Now, I know a lot of people don't like their work, which is unfortunate. I know for me, I'm fortunate that I love my work. I jump out of bed in the morning early, I have my routine, and I'm so anxious to get to work. That's my purpose. It drives me. I have a lot of other purposes as well. And we need to get to that as a population in Canada. We need for people to be incentivized and put more money in their pockets. One of the ideas that my friend Jack Mintz, very renowned economist, has called for, and I've been trumpeting it as well alongside him, is Big Bang tax reform. And he talks about Big Bang corporate tax reform and Big Bang personal reform. I'm going to talk about Big Bang personal reform because to me, that's a great idea to try to incentivize our population. And so what can we do on the personal tax side? Well, first of all, let's just take a few numbers here. We, as a country, federally at least anyhow, heavily rely on personal tax revenues to fund government. It vacillates anywhere from about 45 to about 47% of all federal revenues are derived from personal tax. Now, our personal tax rates are very high comparatively, both as we compare to our south neighbor and around the world. We're one of the highest personal tax countries in the world. And so with that in mind, I go to a famous quote that the Royal Commission on Taxation put out in 1966. And for those that need a reminder, we've only had one comprehensive tax review in Canada. We've had some other, tax reviews and reforms, but the most comprehensive one was commissioned as the Royal Commission on Taxation by then PM John Diefenbaker in 1962. Now, Diefenbaker got voted out of office the next year in 1963, so Lester Pearson, the successor prime minister, allowed the commission to continue, and ultimately they released their report in 1966. So 4 years after implementation, they released a very comprehensive 6-volume report, and there is a bunch of recommendations in there. I won't talk about all the recommendations. Some were accepted, some were amended, and some were outright rejected when comprehensive tax reform was implemented on January 1st, 1972. But one of the famous quotes that was in that report talks about personal tax rates, and the recommendation that they made back then is just as valid today as it was back then. And without parroting the recommendation word for word, it basically said that personal tax rates, combined federally and provincially, should not exceed 50%, because there's a psychological barrier for people to work harder if they know that more than half of their efforts are being taken in tax. I totally agree with that. When I look at my tax bill, I look at some of my clients' tax bills, and if friends talk about their tax bills, and they're paying rates of 55% almost, 54% in Ontario and most provinces in Canada, not all, but most, there's a real disincentive to work. And that's not good for our country. It reduces productivity, and it reduces the attraction for successful people to stay in Canada and to attract them to come to Canada. That's just simply not good. So with that premise in mind, I'll give you one more statistic before I give you what I think Big Bang tax reform could look like. So out of all taxpayers in Canada, the bottom 50% of income earners, which is a fairly low number, roughly $40,000 and less is what they earn, they only pay roughly 6%, and it varies anywhere from 6 to about 9%. 9 is actually very rarely achieved, but 6% is roughly the number that bottom 50% of taxpayers cumulatively pay out of all the personal tax revenues in Canada. If you understand that, the bottom 50%, and let's just say there's roughly 30 million taxpayers in Canada, so 15 million taxpayers roughly only pay 6%. Now, is that right or wrong? Well, who knows? I actually think that the rich pay way too much, but should the bottom 50% or the poor pick up that slack if we reduced rates on the wealthy? Probably not. So that's not what I'm advocating. But when I look at that, I think, gee, 6%, that's hardly anything, comparatively at least anyhow. So maybe what we should do is just get rid of those taxpayers from paying any tax, period, because it's somewhat immaterial. So if we could achieve a simplification of the personal tax system by eliminating those 6% revenues from 50% of the population and incentivizing the people that are paying a lot of tax to work harder by bringing down rates, great. Now, there's economists like Jack Mintz and his colleagues who have done a lot of work on this in terms of what should the highest rate be, combined federally and provincially. I can't recall exactly what that number is off the top of my head, but in my head, somewhere around 45% makes sense to me. 45% should be the maximum that Canadians should have to pay on the high end. Now, for those that deal with public policy and understand some of these statistics that I've talked about, if you were to bring down the tax rate and eliminate the bottom 50% from the tax rolls, that would cost the government a ton of money. And I mean a ton of money. And so is it achievable just to do a blunt thing like that? No. It takes more creative thinking, because to just simply reduce tax rates and eliminate the bottom 50%, for example, would cost the government billions and billions and billions of dollars. And so what needs to be done? Well, let's talk about that. But in order to, before I drift into how you pay for it, let me just comparatively talk about eliminating the bottom 50% and what that means. So what that means, in my view, if you look at the United States, for example, you can do itemized deductions, or you can do a standardized deduction. And I'm oversimplifying this for anybody that knows U.S. tax. This is just an illustrative, so don't get too technical on me here. But so if you choose the itemized deduction, then you can claim certain charitable donations and your state tax deductions, and you can claim, mortgage interest and what have you. That's in the so-called itemized deductions, subject to certain limits. Or you can choose so-called standardized deduction, which is a certain number. And in most cases, that standardized deduction will exceed what you would have otherwise achieved on the itemized deduction. And that's kind of the point. The point is to simplify. Hey, you could choose if you want, and if the itemized deductions turns out to be higher than the standardized deduction, then fine. But I think if we were to introduce a system like that in Canada, I'd probably want to do it even more blunter and simpler. No option for itemized deduction. Everybody just gets a standardized deduction. And the idea there would be to choose that number so it gets rid of virtually all of that bottom 50% from paying personal tax. Because in the whole scheme of things, that 6% is not a ton of money. Now, how would you design that? Well, in order to achieve simplification, you would start looking at, okay, what does the existing system have right now? Okay, so you've got medical expense deductions, you've got personal deduction, personal credits. So the point being is you would go through the list and say, yeah, that one goes, that one goes, that one goes, and eliminated a whole bunch of them in favor of this super exemption, super deduction, or in the United States, standardized deduction. I think that makes a hell of a lot of sense and would achieve a lot, and it would get rid of some of the politics that are in the system. Because if you have deductions for this and credits for this, like for example, there's a new personal support workers credit, or what the Liberals called in the recent election, they called it the Heroes Tax Credit, which is designed for certain healthcare workers. I'm all for healthcare workers, don't get me wrong, but why pick healthcare workers as compared to plumbers and carpenters? Are you telling me that plumbers and carpenters and electricians are not as important as the so-called heroes, the healthcare workers? That's politics at its worst, in my view. Get rid of that stuff and in favor of the standardized deduction. So if you did that, I think that achieves some simplification and gets rid of some of the people. Now let's talk about how you pay for it. I don't have all the answers, but I will say that I think it starts with a large review of the government expenditures. And let me give you some background here. So, in 2010, I just got to look at my notes here. So in 2010, we had a government that had 282,980 federal employees. In 2024, we have 367,772. That's a lot. That is a huge increase. Not quite 100,000, but that's a big increase. Now, that number is a bit misleading, because when the federal Liberals took over, there was actually a shrinkage in that 2010 number. In 2015, the federal public service was about 257,000. So it was a significant reduction from the 282,000 in 2010. So really the measure is from 2015, when the Liberals got elected, to 2024, it was over 100,000. It was about 110,000 increase, or 40%. That is a massive increase in the public service, in the federal public service. And did we need that increase in order to keep up with population? No. That's a 3 times increase from population. It's a 3 times, that increase in public service headcount is 3 times faster than the real GDP growth, and 2 times faster than private sector growth. And so, now, to be fair, Prime Minister Carney has announced that they're going to reduce the public sector headcount by 40,000 people. And even then, there's been huge outcries from unions and left-leaning people saying, oh my God, we can't do that. Well, let's just put this into perspective, ladies and gentlemen. If they reduce the public sector by 40,000, oh, and by the way, that's 40,000 in over a number of years. So that is intended to be a 40,000 reduction to 2028. So it's not this current year. That'll be achieved over time. So if we were to reduce 40,000 employees out of the public sector, that still leaves us at roughly 328,000 employees. And our starting point in 2015 was 257,000. So we're not even coming close. Yes, there should be some growth in public sector, but in my view, which is simplistic, admittedly, it should mirror population growth, unless there's other compelling reasons for such growth, which off the top of my head, I can't see it. And so to me, it starts with massive public sector headcount reductions, and looking at other ways to reduce government costs. And once that plan is achieved, then we could look at other ways to achieve if there's still a shortfall, which more than likely there would be, then we look at other ways to try to achieve that big bang personal tax reform. And so, I think I'll leave it at this for today. Otherwise, I could give you an hour and a half lecture. But the long story short is, we need to really, as a population, increase our financial literacy. For the financially illiterate, which is unfortunately probably 95% of Canadians, and I'm not saying that I'm smarter than anybody else, but this is the world I live in, of course. But I'm saying that in order for Canadians to make informed choices and understand that handouts are not great for them and for the long-term future of our country, including their kids and grandchildren, the entrenchment of the welfare state is not good. We need to encourage the value of hard work, incentivize hard work as a country. And that, from a tax policy perspective, in my view, personally, at least anyhow, there's a lot of other things we could do, but personally means that we need personal big bang tax reform. And it starts with the reduction of our tax rates. Is 45% the right number? Yeah, I like that number. Can we achieve that, or does it need to be 46 or 47 or what have you? We can quibble about that. But can we quibble about removing politics from the tax system? No. I think that's just a no-brainer. We need to do that. We need to get rid of the gimmicky stuff like this recent GST, so-called Groceries rebate. We need to get rid of any future stuff like that. The reality is, though, unfortunately, without light being shone on this in a big way, we're going to continue to have gimmicky stuff. But hopefully, you are enlightened by this, and if you like it, please share it with your colleagues, and with more people speaking up, we can ultimately, hopefully, get to a better system. So that's it for today. Thanks very much. Bye now. Well, there you have it. Another episode of In the Mood with Kim GC Moody podcast. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Make sure you like and subscribe and share it with people if you think they'd enjoy it. Until next time, have a great day.